What if everything you were told about Rome was a lie? We hear of emperors, legions, and conquests, but buried beneath the marble of greatness lies a forgotten betrayal. A betrayal not of kings, but of the people. Because the entire history of the Roman Empire wasn't built by Caesars. It was built on the backs of plebeians. Rome's working class used, silenced, and discarded. They believed in SPQR, the Senate, and the people of Rome. But when the moment came, the Senate ruled and the people obeyed. This is the untold story of when the Republic turned against its own. Welcome to Shadows of Ancient History. Long before emperors bathed in marble palaces, before legions conquered distant shores, Rome was simply a city of tribes, her hills dotted with shepherds, and her streets echoing with the barter of farmers and artisans. In 509 BCE, the Romans overthrew their kings and declared themselves a republic. It was a bold experiment in power sharing. The Senate and people of Rome. Senatus Populusque Romanus, or SPQR, became their new mantra, a promise carved into stone, whispered through banners, and burned into history. But beneath that proud motto, a division festered. The Roman populace was split into two classes: the patricians, noble families who claimed descent from the city's founders, and the plebeians, the working majority farmers, laborers, craftsmen, and soldiers. SPQR claimed to unite them. In practice, it did not. The Senate was controlled entirely by patricians. They made the laws, judged the crimes, and led the armies. Meanwhile, plebeians had no voice, no protections, and no rights to hold office. Their labor built Rome, but their names were absent from its history books. One strange early law, for example, forbade plebeians from marrying into patrician families. Even love was segregated by blood and class. And yet for decades, the Republic maintained this fragile illusion of unity. It was a society built on an agreement that the powerful would rule and the rest would follow. Still, the plebeians were not blind. They were the ones conscripted into Rome's endless wars. They bore the weight of taxation. They returned from campaigns to find their lands sold off their families, struggling and their voices silenced. Resentment brooded in every crowded insula and every soldier's tent. Rome's founding promise the people in Senatus Populusque Romanus had begun to rot. Around 494 BCE, the plebeians made their first daring move. Tired of exploitation, they simply walked out. In what became known as the First Secession of the plebs, thousands of citizens abandoned the city and camped on a hill outside Rome. With no laborers, no soldiers, and no food producers, the patricians panicked. The lifeblood of the Republic had gone on strike. This moment shook the foundations of Rome. It was not a riot, not a rebellion, but a disappearance. The patricians begged for negotiations. And from that standoff came the first real concession, the creation of the tribune of the plebs. These tribunes had the power to veto unjust laws, at least in theory. It was a gesture toward equality, but many historians still debate whether it was structural change or simply symbolic containment. Behind closed doors, Senate alliances tightened. New laws passed quietly limiting the scope of plebeian vetoes. And while a few plebeians gained access to low-ranking offices, the higher rungs of power, the consulship, the priesthoods, the Senate itself remained fortified behind aristocratic lineage. The betrayal was subtle. The Senate claimed reform, but reserved real power. The plebeians were given just enough to quiet their unrest, but not enough to change the system. Amid all of this, one event stands out, curiously forgotten in most modern retellings. Around 451 BCE, Rome created a temporary group called the Decemviri, a council of 10 men tasked with codifying Roman law. For a brief moment, even patricians agreed to suspend consular power. But one of the Decemviri, a man named Appius Claudius Crassus, used his authority to attempt a grotesque abuse. He tried to claim a plebeian girl, Virginia, as his slave by manipulating the legal system he had just helped draft. Her father, a Roman soldier, killed her with his own hands to save her honor, then fled to incite the plebs. This tragedy sparked the Second Secession, an even greater upheaval. The plebeians had tasted reform, but what they received was mockery wrapped in law. Even now, historians ask, was SPQR ever meant to include the plebs? The abbreviation was carved into arches and military standards, but never explained. Was it a symbol of shared governance or a public mask for elite control? In the centuries to follow, the line between Senate and people grew ever more complicated. Rome would rise in wealth, land, and legend, but so too would it rise in contradiction. For beneath the marble inscriptions of SPQR were hands that had never signed anything at all. The plebeians had returned to the city, but not in silence. Their secessions had proven something dangerous, that Rome could not function without them. It was a truth the Senate could not erase, no matter how many tribunates they offered or laws they etched into stone. The Republic had opened a door it could no longer close. What followed was a long and bitter standoff known in modern scholarship as the Conflict of the Orders, a centuries-long battle for equality between Rome's social classes. It wasn't fought with swords, but with laws, speeches, boycotts, and bloodless uprisings. A quiet civil war that redefined the word republic. One of the strangest early victories came with the Lex Canuleia passed in 445 BCE. It repealed the ancient ban on intermarriage between patricians and plebeians. The law seemed simple, but it cracked the illusion of sacred bloodlines, and with it the foundation of patrician supremacy. Rome's elite began to panic not because of love between classes, but because of what it meant: shared lineage, shared inheritance, shared power. Then in 367 BCE came a greater breakthrough, the Licinian section laws. Among their many reforms, one stood out: a rule that at least one of the two consuls must be a plebeian. On paper, this meant that the highest magistracy in Rome was now open to the common people. But historians still debate whether this was true progress or a political sleight of hand. Because while the plebeians now had access to office, only the wealthiest among them could realistically afford to run. A new class was emerging, the nobles plebeians, who had risen in status, who shared more in common with patricians than with their fellow farmers. These upwardly mobile elites became the bridge and the barrier between the ruling Senate and the suffering majority. The illusion of equality had been updated. SPQR now appeared more inclusive. But for the average Roman laborer, little had changed. Meanwhile, Rome was expanding. Wars with neighboring tribes, the Samnites, the Gauls, raged across the Italian peninsula. Victory brought glory, and glory brought land. But that land was rarely given to the plebs who fought for it. Instead, it was claimed by aristocrats, divided among generals, or held by speculative investors. The plebeian soldier returned home to find his small plot swallowed by a wealthy estate or seized for unpaid debts. Debt itself became a new form of control. Many plebs desperate for survival were forced into nexum, a bond of debt servitude that left them working lands they once owned. Though technically not slavery, the difference was thin. If a man could not repay, he could be bound to his creditor labor indefinitely, or even be sold into bondage beyond the Tiber. In 326 BCE, public outrage forced the abolition of nexum. The Senate, under pressure, passed the Lex Poetelia Papiria, banning debt bondage once and for all. But once again, the question lingered: was this justice, or was it Rome's way of preventing another secession? The plebeians had gained legal rights, but not economic ones. One strange episode during this time, barely noted in popular history, was the brief rise of a religious revival led by plebeian women. These women, forbidden from most formal offices, turned to the spiritual margins of Roman life, establishing unauthorized cults and rituals on the Aventine Hill. The Senate called it disorder. Temples were shut down or absorbed into the state-approved pantheon. Yet in their chants and symbols, these women echoed a cry that Rome refused to hear: that the sacred and the political had both become tools of the same elite. And in the shadows of these rituals, something else was brewing. The tribunes, once humble defenders of the people, were now playing a dangerous game. By the 2nd century BCE, some tribunes had begun using their powers not to protect the plebs, but to elevate their own status. They vetoed reforms. They blocked laws. They aligned with aristocrats. The voice of the people was being hijacked. In 103 BCE, a spark set the system ablaze. Tiberius Gracchus, a patrician turned plebeian tribune, proposed radical land reforms reclaiming public land held illegally by the wealthy and redistributing it to the poor. He bypassed the Senate, entirely appealing directly to the concilium plebis, the people's assembly. It was a bold move. It was also fatal. Tiberius was murdered by a mob of senators and their allies, clubbed to death with pieces of furniture in a riot that spilled into the streets. The Republic had crossed a threshold. Political violence was now an acceptable answer to reform. 10 years later, his brother Gaius Gracchus took up the cause, proposing grain subsidies, judicial reforms, and even Roman citizenship for allied Italian states. He, too, was hunted down, trapped on the Aventine Hill. Gaius ordered his slave to kill him before the Senate could. These murders sent shockwaves through the Republic. The people mourned. The Senate congratulated itself. And the divide once hidden beneath the marble slogans of SPQR now cracked open into full view. The plebeians had tasted what the Republic could have been, a system that actually served its people. But each taste came with blood. Each hope ended in betrayal. Rome, it seemed, could tolerate everything but justice. From this point on, plebeian faith in the Republic began to erode. Tribunes became demagogues. Senators became oligarchs. The city grew larger, richer, louder. But the dream of a shared republic shrank into silence. What remained was spectacle, bread, games, and the ghost of what SPQR had promised, but never delivered. By the 1st century BCE, Rome's population had swelled to over 1 million, a chaotic sea of immigrants, freed slaves, artisans, and day laborers, all crammed into the city's dense, creaking neighborhoods. The plebeians, once the proud citizen soldiers of the early republic, had become a voiceless majority, restless, hungry, and expendable. The Senate knew this, so they crafted an illusion so powerful, so enduring, that even modern democracies would copy it. They gave the people bread, and they gave them games. What began as small religious festivals evolved into massive public spectacles. Gladiators bled on sand imported from distant provinces. Exotic beasts were dragged into the Colosseum, elephants from Africa, tigers from the east. The crowd roared, their hunger forgotten. Grain was distributed in measured rations subsidized by the state. If stomachs were full and minds distracted, few would ask who held the reins of power. Historians call this the politics of appeasement, a strategy of distraction through indulgence. And it worked. Rome entered an era of engineered stability. Senators competed not for reforms, but for crowd-pleasing generosity. The more lavish the spectacle, the more votes one secured, and the more detached the people became from real governance. Behind the scenes, the Republic was crumbling. The Senate grew increasingly corrupt. Offices were bought, laws were auctioned. Wealth, not virtue, became the measure of political worth. Public land intended for redistribution was devoured by a handful of elite families who expanded their latifundia, vast estates worked by slaves. Meanwhile, small plebeian farms vanished. Those displaced flooded into the city, forming a desperate, dependent, urban class. And here lies a cruel irony. The plebs who once seceded to demand rights now willingly gave their loyalty to whoever could offer grain and a show. The very soul of the Republic had inverted. Power no longer flowed upward from the people, it flowed downward from oligarchs who could afford to maintain the illusion of public care. A strange and telling event occurred in 58 BC. Publius Clodius Pulcher, a populist tribune, passed a law making grain handouts completely free. It won him immense popularity. He then used that popularity to wage a private gang war against his enemies, arming street thugs and clashing with senatorial militias. Rome's capital became a battleground, ruled not by law, but by crowd manipulation. At the same time, tribunes had become tools of political warfare. No longer guardians of the common people, they were instruments of the rich mouthpieces for aristocrats seeking populist support. SPQR remained engraved on every standard and building, but its meaning was hollow. Then came a name that would haunt the Republic forever: Gaius Julius Caesar. A patrician by birth, Caesar knew how to speak like a plebeian. He knew the power of gesture the way a speech, a feast, or a battle won could stir the hearts of the crowd. He allied himself with the people's interests, land for veterans, debt relief, citizenship for the provinces, but always with a purpose to bypass the Senate. His military campaigns in Gaul brought him wealth, loyalty, and fame, but more importantly, they gave him an army that answered to him, not the state. The Senate watched nervously as Caesar's power grew. When ordered to disband his forces, he did something no Roman general was supposed to do. He crossed the Rubicon. It was a line both literal and symbolic, the point beyond which a Roman general could not lead his army without declaring war on the Republic. By crossing it, Caesar made a single statement: "I no longer ask for permission." The plebeians did not resist him. They welcomed him. To them, Caesar wasn't a tyrant, he was a redeemer. He represented the first leader in generations who seemed to care about their plight. He forgave debts, he distributed land, he cut through the Senate's endless delays and gave the people results. But historians still debate, was Caesar's populism sincere or simply strategic? Many believe Caesar never intended to restore the Republic. Rather, he used the grievances of the plebs as a lever to collapse the old order and build a new one centered entirely around himself. Yet at the time, most plebeians didn't care. After all, what had the Senate ever done for them? For centuries, it had promised representation and delivered exploitation. The noble slogans of SPQR were now seen for what they were: a theater. And so, in one of history's strangest reversals, the very people who once fought to defend the Republic now cheered its unraveling. They had been conditioned to love the man who fed them, not the system that had failed them. One particularly strange but revealing detail: when Caesar returned from Gaul, he minted coins, not with SPQR, but with his own face, something no living Roman had dared to do. The coin became a message: "The Republic is me." And Rome listened. It was as if the ancient promise of SPQR Senate and people had been replaced with a new one: Caesar and spectacle. Plebeian identity, once forged in defiance and sacrifice, had become transactional. They no longer sought power, they sought a provider. They had forgotten they were the Republic, and that forgetfulness would change everything. When Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, it was not the plebeians who rejoiced, it was the Senate. Brutus and Cassius' daggers, still wet with history, stood over Caesar's body, claiming to have saved the Republic. The conspirators imagined themselves as restorers of liberty, but liberty by then was a word that no longer stirred the hearts of the people. The plebeians did not see Caesar as a tyrant. They saw him as the first leader in generations who had spoken their name without scorn. His funeral was not a quiet affair. It was an eruption. Mobs tore through the streets. His wax effigy, pierced with wounds, was paraded through the forum. His body was burned on an improvised pyre as chants of grief rose like smoke. That night, the Republic died, not with a declaration, but with the silence of the people who no longer cared to defend it. Into that silence stepped Octavian Caesar's adopted heir, barely 19 years old, calculating and cold. He aligned with Mark Antony and Lepidus in a temporary power-sharing deal known as the Second Triumvirate, and together they hunted Caesar's killers. What followed was a purge. Thousands were executed. The Senate became a rubber stamp, and once again the plebs watched and applauded. Octavian, who would soon call himself Augustus, understood something the old senators never did. Rome was no longer a republican spirit, it was a performance. Power now belonged to whoever could command the illusion best. Augustus mastered that illusion. He called himself Princeps, first citizen, never king. He restored temples, funded roads, staged endless games. He spoke of mos maiorum, the ancestral way. But all decisions flowed through him. The Senate still met, the laws were still voted on. SPQR still adorned every standard and coin. But now it meant something different. It meant obedience, a decorative veil over absolute control. And the plebeians, they cheered. To them, Augustus brought peace, the Pax Romana, after decades of civil war. He stabilized grain supplies, created jobs, and revived public works. Life improved, or seemed to. The memory of the Republic faded beneath monuments and marble. The people who had once seceded from Rome in protest now gave standing ovations to their emperors. One strange detail underscores the shift. The Temple of Caesar, erected after his death, became a pilgrimage site not for elites but for the working poor. They left flowers, coins, and prayers, not to a cult but to a man who in their eyes had remembered them. The Senate's marble halls held no such affection. Historians still debate when the Roman Republic truly ended. Some say it died with Caesar, others argue it unraveled long before, when the Senate first refused real reform, or when plebeian leaders were bought and silenced. But one thing is clear: the betrayal of the plebs was not just a failure of policy, it was a failure of memory. By the time the emperors arrived, the people had forgotten that the Republic was theirs to protect. They mistook imperial benevolence for civic participation. They traded freedom for stability, and in doing so allowed SPQR to become little more than a relic. The final tragedy: the plebeians, once the heart of the Republic, became spectators to their own disappearance. The hands outstretched for grain, the cheers that echoed as emperors paraded through triumphal arches. Their blood built the empire, but their names were left off its pillars. And so the story ends, not with the clash of armies, but with the quiet submission of a people who no longer believed they mattered. The Senate and people of Rome, Senatus Populusque Romanus. But the Senate had become a symbol, and the people had stopped listening. The marble crumbled long ago, the banners faded, the legions dissolved into dust. But the echoes of the entire history of the Roman Empire still breathe beneath every modern empire. SPQR was never just a slogan, it was a promise, a delicate thread between ruler and ruled, a vision of shared power etched into stone, but not into practice. For a time, the plebeians believed. They marched, they protested, they seceded. They demanded a place in the Republic they built with their hands. But over centuries, through manipulation, fear, and distraction, that belief eroded, not all at once, but gradually, quietly, with every empty reform, with every grain handout, with every spectacle in place of justice. And in that forgetting, they lost their voice. Rome did not collapse in a single moment. It was hollowed from within, first spiritually, then politically. The people no longer recognized their reflection in the Senate's polished floors. They saw strangers in the marble statues. And when the emperors came promising peace and bread, they said yes, not out of loyalty, but out of fatigue. Perhaps the greatest betrayal of the Republic was not done by Caesar, but by time. Time which turned citizens into spectators, participants into followers. And perhaps the greatest lesson of SPQR is this: if the people do not protect the promise, the Senate will forget it, and the empire will return.